Hi, my name is Lindsey Dunnagan, and I run the painting department at Truman State University. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my creative research and what I teach at Truman, and also the path of how I got to where I am today. So after high school, I decided to get a degree in architecture from Texas A&M University. The degree was called a Bachelor of Environmental Design. And then I worked in the field for a little bit and thought, this really isn't a good fit for me. So I joined the Peace Corps. And because of all the art that I was doing when I was getting my architecture degree, they thought I would be a good fit to work with artisans in Morocco. So I lived in Azilel, Morocco for 2 years and 3 months, and I helped develop the small business of artisans. And in this picture, you can kind of see some of the people that I worked with. I also made a website that you can visit. You can go to azilelprovince.wix.com/Morocco. And I made that website in like 2008. So it's pretty old, but it still exists. Then I came back to Texas, where I had some family at the time, and decided that I was going to just go ahead and pursue art, my passion. And I got my Master of Fine Arts degree in art, in painting, and from Texas Women's University, and then also a master's in art history from there as well. I worked in Texas for a bit, and then in 2016, I moved to Kirksville to work at Truman State. All right, so here is a screenshot of my website, which is just my name, lindseydunnagan.com. You can visit it to see all of the portfolios that I have. And I'm just going to talk to you about the work that I've done from 2017. So I actually make a lot of artwork, and this is just a little selection of what I do. All right, so this first series is called Natural Liquidation, and you can see it here in Missouri, in Kansas City, actually. There's a gallery called Weinberger Fine Art, and they show this work. Also in Dallas, Texas, Carneal Simmons Contemporary shows this work as well. And these pieces are a combination of maps that are personally significant. So I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska, and that's where my dad still lives. And my childhood was spent flying back and forth from Alaska to Texas, where my mom lived. And I would just spend the plane trip looking out the window, seeing the division in the land, those rivers and valleys, and kind of think about how my nuclear family was also divided similarly. And so landscape really became an important part of my visual language from an early age. And that's how it sort of translated to this. Then in college, I studied abroad in Barcelona, Spain, and that place became pretty important to me. And then, of course, Morocco. So all of these places come together and create kind of an atlas of memory. And you can see that I'm actually painting them on plexiglass, which is a clear substance. So you can see through the first layer to the second. And then I also layer pieces on top of each other. And what that does is it sort of obscures layers below. And that obscurity I find really interesting because it's sort of like how memory gets lost over time, is harder to access. And so these places are similarly kind of disappearing in my mind over time. Now, to get those unusually shaped substrates, what I do is I draw them first. So I'm basing the exterior on a map, several maps that I put together. I draw it out by hand, and then I take a photograph, bring it into Adobe InDesign, and I trace that map with a line on the computer to create a vector image. So a vector image means you can blow it up or shrink it down and no pixelation happens. It'll stay true. And then I take this map to a company that has what's called a CNC router. Also, laser cutters work pretty well with this process. And they cut out the substrates that I need. So here's a picture of an actual CNC router at work cutting out one of my images. I'm going to play this for you. Kind of loud, sorry. I'm using an air gun to blow out all the debris, and you can see the shapes that this router has already cut. There's a piece of wood underneath the plexiglass, and the CNC router goes all the way through the plexiglass and just touches the wood to make sure that the cut is clean. The reason why it's blue is because it's a protective film that goes on top of it. So you can see here a finished shape that looks blue. It's actually clear. That's just the protective film. And then I turn that into these paintings. That's watercolor. And then that gold is actually spray paint. So I find that spray paint adheres really well to plexiglass and it looks like gold leaf, which is nice. And you can also see that I'm painting on the front and the back. So, whoops. This is the front, and then this is an image of the back. And I do have some new work in this series that is not here on this slideshow, but you can see it on my website, and it'll be in my galleries soon as well. All right, so the second series I'm going to talk to you about is called Northern Catch, and it's actually pretty similar to the previous series because they consist of paintings on plexiglass, but they're different in some fundamental ways. So in this work, I'm actually taking imagery from my childhood in Anchorage, Alaska, including the aurora borealis and fishnets and icebergs. And I'm just combining all of those shapes and images and colors into these paintings. And so it's just really a pleasure project. It's a project that is very formally concerned. So it's just a lot of fun. And here is a video that I took of me adding alcohol inks after I've already done the drawing of a fishnet. So this fishnet drawing is on one side of plexiglass, and the ink that you see on top is on the other side, and that's why they can interact. I'm shooting a heat gun at the wet ink, and what that does is it allows the ink to move around in these beautiful ways. And actually in my classroom, I have alcohol inks and I also have heat guns, and my students and I play around with it in the classroom. I really like to bring things that I learned and that I think are valuable in my studio practice to my students so that I can teach them sort of, what I'm finding that's working in the field, and then they can experiment and play as well. It's just really lovely. So after I've done the alcohol ink stuff and I've drawn the fishnet, I traced a bunch of icebergs. So I take these drawings, I place them on the plexiglass, and then I put tape, painter's tape underneath it, and then cut out the shapes that I want. So you can see here the first three processes. Here I've traced a fishnet. Here is the alcohol ink on the other side. And then here are all of those pieces of tape that are now in the shape of icebergs. And then after that, that's when the spray paint comes in. So I take stencils that I've created and I lay them down and I spray paint all the different colors to get this image. And then after that, I remove those images of icebergs. And so it has this really nice combination of crisp, where the tape was very crisp, and then a little bit fuzzy, where I'm just using a kind of open stencil. These are very early works that I did in 2017. And you can see how those colors all come into play, and the front and the back of the plexiglass show through. And then excitingly, I started working with a laser cutter this year, and I got a grant from Truman State to continue pursuing this project. So you're going to see a whole lot more work in this series that is not just on paper, but also on plexiglass and also on board. So this is just sort of the beginning of where I am now. This is called Mirage. This is paper that has been cut out using a laser cutter, and then all of these little pieces are pieces of cut paintings that were layered underneath it. It's kind of hard to describe, but I'm going to show you a video that illustrates this process. So you can see this has been laser cut. Then I trace the image of the fishnet onto the paper and then turn that tracing into a graphite drawing, which to me resembles a shadow. So I'm trying to create this shadow on top, which is not really where a shadow belongs, right? Shadows are underneath things. And then I take these paintings that I've cut out into the shapes of fishnet and icebergs, layer them, place them appropriately, and then I put real silver leaf on them. So what you're seeing on the right, that's real silver leaf that I'm putting onto all those layers. And then I glue it all on, which is actually kind of a terrifying process because if you have any stray glue marks, that can attract dirt. So you have to be really careful if you want things to be pristine. And then in the end, I have this image that's not doing what you would expect it to do, right? The shadow is on top. The colorful image that feels like the foreground is actually the background. And what I love about the laser cutter is it creates sort of this lovely edge that gives you a real shadow, and that also kind of burns the paper, so it's a little bit yellow. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening that I'm excited to continue thinking about and pursuing. Then I'm also going to be cutting out a lot of new substrates, like I said. So if you look carefully, this is actually a sheet of plexiglass that's cut into the shape of a fishnet that I'm holding. And I'm going to be doing a whole lot more of those, and they will be painted on. All right. And so this next series I'm going to talk to you about, which is the third series that I started since 2017, is called Estate Sale. And this work really came from my observations of wild flora in Missouri when I was going through the forests and walking. And I started doing some research, and I started talking to the Missouri Department of Conservation, and found out that we are losing a lot of really important flora, and especially our wild grasslands, the prairies. And so this series is exploring what we're losing. You might notice that this substrate is wood, and it's cut into an unusual shape. That shape is actually a pendant, so a necklace that I own. And I was thinking about jewelry that you pass down through generations, and this jewelry that contains precious stones, and how we are losing our natural heritage, this precious thing. And so instead of painting a precious stone inside of this jewelry pendant, I'm painting flora that we're losing. And then the series is called Estate Sale. So we're sort of bargaining to progress our human endeavors. We're also losing our natural heritage. We might not be able to pass down all of the things that we value. So here are some substrates that are cut out. You can see before I start to work on them. And then I start to work on them with watercolor pencil and pen, and I'm also using graphite. And I try to highlight elements that we're losing with the pen or graphite, so they become kind of a background image. After I started working, though, I realized that almost all of the flora that I was painting was endangered, which was just a crazy thing to find out. So, this is running buffalo clover, and that is another endangered flora, which is just really too bad. And then if you look up closely, you'll see some gold leafing. And this gold leafing is 24 karat gold. So I really like the addition of this precious metal, because I think it really relates to having a pendant. That's my kitten, if you heard that. And I have done a lot of work with gold leaf, imitation gold leaf. And finally, I just thought, you know what? I feel comfortable enough. I'm going to switch to the real deal. You'll also see a lot of hands in my work. And that idea of hands is, people caring for the environment, but also manipulating it. So we have this really interesting relationship with the environment. You can see the gold leafing here. It's always that shiny gold portion. And then the pen, of course, representing what we're losing. I installed this work at Truman State University, I think last year. And I painted the walls, it's dark blue, and then put stencils over it of all the endangered species. And what it became was kind of this really interesting sort of mosaic of pendants that were fully realized on top of a wallpaper type look. And now the series is in Denver, Colorado, at a Bend Gallery. Unfortunately, we were not able to have the opening reception due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but the work is still available at the gallery. All right, the last series that I'm going to talk to you about is called Skimming Boundaries. And it is all about my grandmother who had Alzheimer's for the last 10 years of her life. She sort of came in and out of awareness of who she was, who we were. And I tried to represent those moments of mental decline through areas in the composition that sort of poke through. So you see something in reality and then this interference. So just sort of a process of mourning her decline in this series. And also thinking about, you know, what happens when you do die, where do you go? And in the work, I begin with naturally dying paper. So I take cabbage and raspberries and I boil them and then place them on the paper with rocks. And then you end up with these really amazing imprints, these naturally dyed imprints. And then from there, I work with charcoal and watercolor pencil on top to get various images. And one thing that was really important to me, like I said, was making sure that the background actually played an important role in the foreground. All of this work is going to be at Culver-Stockton at the end of August. And so when you see this movie, it might still be there. This is a painting. So most of these are drawings, but this is a painting. I experimented with naturally dyeing raw canvas, and you can actually see that poking through here. And then I used acrylic paint to get the foreground. And then I also used real gold leaf in some of these areas as well. So it has a bit of a shine to it. And then figures are dissolving, the landscape is dissolving into the background. And then I also just did a pure painting. This is oil on canvas, so there's no natural dye here, but it's from the same series, and then I have some gold leafing. I still have lots of ideas for this series, so there's more work that I plan to do. So in all of the things that you saw today, I'm actually still working on all of them. I began them sort of around the same time, those 4 different series, and then I'm continuing them today. Thanks.